Hello and welcome back to NoBS. Today we return to talking about our favorite animated cartoon satirical show called South Park. South Park has come up again for a number of reasons recently. More specifically, we recently talked about South Park and how some of their episodes got pulled because they were too offensive in this current very PC climate. In addition, South Park has been referenced because other cartoon shows like Family Guy and The Simpsons have been caving into SJWs and letting their actors resign and give up roles because they want minority characters to be played by minorities now. And they're kind of kowtowing to this whole system and what's going on in the news and current events. And the reason South Park is involved is because we all know they would make fun of this stuff hardcore. They would never cave in. They would never give up to this crappy idea that certain actors have to voice certain roles and things are offensive. That's like the opposite of South Park. South Park is all about being just totally non-politically correct, totally saying whatever they want. They're against cancel culture and all that fun stuff. And so what recently has come up is some older South Park episodes have come to light. We've discussed a few from recent seasons, like their Columbus Day episode. That was relevant again recently because Columbus Day and Columbus and his statues have been getting taken down recently. And that's something South Park talked about back in 2017. Now, this time, today, we're going back to the year 2000. There's a couple episodes from season 4 from the year 2000. In the year 2000. That's how Conan used to say on his show. But you know what I mean. This episode and these episodes we're talking about, we're going to get to one today and one in another video a few days from now. But basically, what I realized was these episodes from season 4 have a lot of relevant things that play back into what's happening now. I know it's 20 years ago, but South Park still holds up really well. In fact, a lot of their arguments and points in these episodes we're going to talk about are still relevant today. Today's episode we're going over is called Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000, and it's relevant for a lot of reasons, which we're going to get into soon. But first, let's take a quick moment to check out our sponsor. A new bill has hit Washington, and it's trying to invade your privacy right now. It's called the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act, and if passed, it will be the end to warrant-proof encryption, meaning both you and I won't have privacy from the government, even encrypted data. That's why I do everything I can to ensure my privacy online, which means always keeping my VPN or virtual private network turned on. Using a VPN will hide your location online and stop advertisers from creating a profile about you, and it will also allow you to surf the web anonymously. That's why I recommend a VPN, and I also recommend the company I love and trust, Virtual Shield. So make sure you check out the link below or go to virtualshield.com/NoBS and start protecting yourself online today. Thanks for your time, and now back to the show. Great, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about this hate crime episode. Basically, I saw this episode pop up in season 4 when I was looking at another one, which we'll get to later, but this silly hate crime episode is actually relevant today because hate crimes are still a big thing. They actually have been coming up in the news recently because there's been a couple hate crime hoaxes. Last year we had the Jussie Smollett hoax, but this year we had a couple of new ones, like from Bubba Wallace in NASCAR, him supposedly finding this racist rope in his garage. So I thought with that in mind, it would be funny to bring up this South Park hate crime episode. It comes again from 2000. And the one thing I want to point out that's interesting that I almost didn't realize at first was the year 2000 was another election year. So a lot of the reasons these things are relevant and similar again is because during election years, a lot of things seem to happen. There seems to be a lot of unrest. A lot of people tend to protest and bring up things like racism and hate crimes and stuff like that, which is a lot of the kind of things that we're seeing right now. We're seeing that in 2020 as well. And apparently a lot of the same things happened in 2000. There was a very contentious election later in the year, and I think this episode and what happened throughout the season is also very related because not only did hate crimes come up, but the next episode we're going to cover in another video talks about how flags were offensive now, and there's a whole episode about that we're going to do in the next video. But today, let's focus on this one. It's called Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000. It's the second episode from the 4th season on the television series South Park, of course. It aired on April 12th, 2000, and is the second of 4 episodes that end in the title 2000. Now, they did this as a joke because back then, a lot of things had this 2000 title on them. Like, people were just obsessed with that number back then. It became this sort of meme, and, you know, it was significant because think about it. There was hundreds of years where it was the 1900s, the 1800s, the 1700s, like many years before we hit this milestone. So coming across 2000 was a big deal. I remember it was a big deal as a kid, and a lot of people talked about it. So that's why things use this name. And then South Park did it as a joke. As you could see, they named a number of episodes like this. And it was just a funny little goof. And it plays into this whole year and also the history of what's going on. So with that said, let's get into the plot, and then we'll talk about things beat by beat. The third grade girls, led by Lizzie, challenge the boys to a sled race down Phil Collins Hill. After the boys accept the challenge, Cartman gets into an argument with Token because he keeps reminding him about his obesity. Cartman threatens to throw a rock at Token's face if he ever calls him fat again. Kyle then calls Cartman a fat ass instead, causing him to throw a rock at Token, giving him a black eye in the process, much to Kyle's shock. Because Token is African American, the FBI and the entire media overreact to the situation. Assuming that the rock was thrown because of racism and not provocation, the government tries Cartman in a federal court. The prosecution's case, although utterly nonsensical, is accepted by the judge, who wishes to make an example out of Cartman to warn against racists. Cartman is convicted of a hate crime and sentenced to juvenile prison until he reaches the age of 21. Cartman escapes the courtroom and enlists Kenny in his Go-Go Action Bronco toy car to flee to Mexico. But the toy car goes extremely slow and they eventually fail after it runs out of battery. Cartman is taken to jail and he's given his number 24601. So a lot to explain here already. First of all, let's start with Phil Collins. This is a joke and a reference that comes up a couple of times this season. I've been rewatching season 4, and season 4 is actually one of the first seasons that happened not only after the South Park movie, which came out in 99, but also after the Oscars. South Park's movie was actually nominated for an Oscar or two, specifically the best song. Their song Blame Canada was nominated for best song in a film, but they lost to Phil Collins. Phil Collins, of course, did the soundtrack for Tarzan that year, and his song won over South Park's, and apparently they took umbrage with that, and they kind of just goofed on Phil Collins ever since then. It's a kind of funny little joke, an in-joke. They don't really reference the Oscar themselves, but if you know what's going on, you could see why that happens. Phil Collins is also known to be a bit of a jerk. He has a bad reputation, so there's good reason for them to mock him. Next, we talk about Token. Token is, of course, the token black character on South Park who is literally called Token as a joke, and he's actually been on the show since the beginning, but as a background character. He's the black character in South Park, the black kid. And the thing is, though, this is his first major role in an episode. This is the first time he's talking a lot. He has a main role as Cartman's sort of adversary for part of this. And that's what leads into this whole bogus hate crime thing. The bad thing about this is, and what we get to later is, hate crime laws are just bogus. It's just not really making sense. It's kind of hypocritical too, because what they say is a crime is bad, but it's worse if the crime is done to someone who's not your same skin color. I mean, that's essentially the premise for these hate crimes. It's saying if it's involving different races, it's like more important for some reason, which is just kind of absurd. And it's also just, how do you prove hate? I mean, hate is already implied in these crimes. Like, you don't throw rocks at someone you don't like. So Cartman was hating on whoever it was. It didn't really have to do with skin color. Sure, there are some racist and motivated crimes out there. This happens, of course, but the whole hate crime law is just bogus. And it's important that they talk about it here for a very important reason. And actually, if you think about it, this was actually when they first started hate crime laws. I mean, I don't know if they've been around in another form or something, but hate crime laws actually first came into vogue around 20 years ago. Now they seem like normal old hat in the present, but this is when they first popped up. So that's why South Park chose to make this episode to lampoon them and goof on them. And that's why I say it's still relevant today, because we're still talking about hate crimes and they still get put on the news, and there's a lot of fake hate crimes. That's the problem with today, though, is they're mostly fake because they can't actually find real hate crimes anymore, so they have to make them up. The next part worth explaining is this Go-Go Action Bronco toy car. This is a goof on O.J. Simpson and how he tried to flee from the police when he was getting arrested. He killed his wife and her lover and tried to get away from the cops in a white Bronco. This happened a few years before this episode. And in this episode of South Park, they turn it into a toy Bronco that Kenny drives to try to get Cartman out of the country. Let's read on now then. The boys realize that they have always taken Cartman's ass for granted, and without his weight on the back of their sled, starts calling him fat. Clyde tries to get them to stop and yells, "God damn it," seeing that he is like Cartman. When they sled down the hill, however, they find they are only average speed, as Cartman's fat helped the boys go faster. They kick Clyde off and instead use bricks disguised as a kid, having pants and jacket on it, to help them get faster, but this sled goes too fast and starts to spin. Stan and Kyle manage to jump off, but Kenny flies off the sled into a tree where he's crushed by the brick person. Stan and Kyle then realize the only way to win is to make Token forgive Cartman. Token is willing to forgive Cartman, but Token's father, who is himself against hate crime laws, tells the boys that they will have to convince the governor of Colorado to free Cartman after a failed attempt to sneak in a nail file hidden inside a cake for Cartman to bust out of jail. The boys then put on a presentation before the governor, complete with visual aids, in which they detail their opposition to hate crime laws. Declaring it a savage hypocrisy, their visual has it misspelt as savage hypocrisy, and arguing that in all forms of crime warrant some sort of hate and that the laws serve only to encourage discrimination further. The governor is impressed, claiming that it made more sense than anything else he's heard in the last 3 years. Here's where they get into that explanation I was going over briefly, basically talking about how it's hypocritical, how all crimes involve some kind of hate or some kind of anger, and putting this kind of racial tint on it is just unnecessary. It's trying to pander, and it's like a very liberal kind of thing. Liberal judges want to do this. They want to kind of protect the blacks and give them extra protection, but it also just kind of makes things worse and encourages discrimination, as they say, and it's also hypocritical. And I mean, the laws are already there. If you're going to have a crime, if you're going to throw a rock at someone in Cartman's case, or say beat them up or something, I mean, putting the whole hate crime on it, it doesn't really change anything. Like, it's just trying to give them extra punishment, which is not really necessary. I mean, a crime is a crime. If you're motivated by race, or you're motivated by hate, or you need money, like whatever the motivation is not necessarily the case here. It's not what's important. Now, motivation does play a part in other crimes, like certain crimes like murder and stuff like that. I know that's part of it, but the whole hate crime thing is basically bogus. Meanwhile, Cartman adapts to life in prison by smuggling in things for his cellmate, Romper Stomper, who along with Cartman escapes the prison after feeling sorry for him and that he wishes to see Disneyland. They are caught by authorities who take Romper back to prison but tell Cartman he has been pardoned by the governor. Cartman returns home, arriving at the sled race just in time as they're about to begin, and helps the boys beat the girls by throwing out 2 yellow buckets that Romper himself used as footwear until he gives them to Cartman. Cartman throws those at the sled, causing them to fall off the cliff and land in a pile of snow, after which one girl is eaten by a bear. The boys celebrate their victory and promise to Cartman that they will never exploit him ever again. After Pip refers to Cartman as a big fat, Cartman throws a rock at Pip, but this time gets away with it as injuring British people does not count as a hate crime. Cartman decides to pay a visit to Romper, who always wished to see Disneyland, and grants his wish by defecating Disneyland off camera, having smuggled it in his butt, much to Romper's delight. So this last part is kind of a joke on prison life and how they sneak stuff in their behinds. There's also some references to Oz here. Oz was a popular prison show on HBO at this time in the late 90s, and they kind of have this Oz vibe to it. There's like a lot of things going on in prison. People sneak things in their butts, and here at the end, there's a big joke that Cartman is actually crapping out Disneyland, like the whole Disneyland theme park is in his butt, which actually is another funny reference because he goes and he's kind of squeezing it out off camera and you just hear him. And it's funny because he's like, oh, there's that ride. He says, oh, he's going through each ride. He's like, oh, there's Magic Mountain. Oh, there's Splash Mountain. He goes through them all. And I think the reference to Splash Mountain is kind of funny because that just recently came up in a video we made and in a reference in political culture. I mean, Disney just announced they're reframing and remaking the Splash Mountain ride. So it was funny to hear Cartman reference it here. And it's funny just how things come full circle with this stuff. Like we were talking about how this connects to the present. I think it's very relative. 20 years ago seems like a long time, but we're still talking about relative things. We're talking about things like O.J. Simpson, black people getting away with crimes. We're talking about hate crimes being kind of a bogus thing that just don't help anything. They're just terribly biased and kind of racist on their own. Hate crimes are being faked now. They were being talked about back then. There was also an election going on back then. This was earlier. This is April, so that's early in the year. Things will get more political, I think, as this South Park season goes. So we might cover some more episodes here. I know at least one more episode. We're going to cover the flag episode, as I promised, as I told you about. That's the next South Park video, which will come in a couple days. If you want it to come faster, though, make sure you like this video. I'm going to go ahead and make that video as soon as we get 1,000 likes on this one. So like this one up. Once we get to 1,000, I'm going to make that next video and get you guys more South Park videos. I like these talks. These are fun. I like going over the comments and the jokes and laughing with you guys, talking about our favorite show, and also getting into the politics and the current events. With all that said, make sure you guys have a great day. Also, comment your thoughts on everything below. Let me know what you have to say. And until next time, take care.